NIH about a year ago came forward with a new option called multiple principal investigators, not to be confused with what we've always had, which is the principal investigator and then co-investigators, the team. Now the NIH has a new option called multiple principal investigators. So let's say you're doing an R01, and again, to use some of the research that I know people are carrying out here, let's say you're looking at research, you're the PI for a research component that has to do with the Native Hawaiian population, looking at diabetes prevention on this population, and let's say you're going in with a PI, another researcher in Alaska, who's going to focus on the Alaskan population. Well, if you're coming in as two equals, you can come in for something called multiple principal investigators. There's a whole website devoted to this. If you just go on to nih.gov and punch in the words multiple principal investigators, it will give you an exact game plan how to go about doing this. I want to mention it because it's out there. I also want to say that it's been in existence for a year or so. Most grants, the vast, overwhelming majority of grants submitted under this new option have not been successful. The most common criticism, by far, has been that the teams coming in have typically been one leader and one subordinate, like let's say an assistant prof and a postdoc trying to come in as multiple PIs. That will not work. You must be seen as truly equal partners. So, the last part of, I think, of preliminary studies, you want to establish credibility. Anything you say you're going to do, you need to show you have the expertise to do. How do we show expertise? Publications, through collaborators. If the collaborators are outside your institution, you have to have a letter of support from them. If you don't have that letter of support, you won't even be reviewed. So this is crucial. Credibility. How do you show credibility? By showing what you've done. Photographs, visual evidence, tables, charts of data that you've got. Sometimes we think, well, I'll just take these data, it's an awful lot of data, I'll put it into the appendix. An appendix is useful, but only your primary and secondary reviewers are going to look at it. So just keep that in mind. So don't bury something in the appendix if it's something that you really are hoping that every reviewer will at least leaf past. So finally, what do you do if you find gaps? You've written up this research grant, and all of a sudden you realize, oh wow, there's this gap between what I'm proposing and the expertise of my team. Typical gap from conversations yesterday. Let's say that you don't have a biostatistician available to you, and you really need biostatistical support. What do? Do you submit and just hope the reviewers won't notice? Do you do the best you can and write up, based on your memory of biostat from, whenever you took the class? I think that's high risk. If there's a real obvious gap, recruit someone, hire a consultant. Anything you say you're going to do, make sure you have expertise correlated to it. It is an obvious thing to criticize, it's an easy thing to criticize, and it's something you can expect every reviewer to look at. Every reviewer will look at whatever you're proposing to do in the research design and methods and say, do you have the expertise? Does a member of your team have the expertise? Demonstrate teamwork, collaboration, and as I said before, to my mind, an overview of the team, identifying what each person is bringing, what research skills, terrific way to start the preliminary studies section. Don't have a huge number of collaborators. That can also be tempting. We can think, oh, I'll really impress my reviewers. I'll have 10 collaborators. That's going to start to get very expensive because collaborators aren't for free. You have to pay them a percent depending on how much time they're spending on the grant. We don't want to ever go in with a disproportionately expensive grant. My advice, and again, this isn't Wendy advice, this is NIH advice, and it is pretty much across the board from the NIH. New investigators, when you're submitting an RO1, don't go above $250,000 a year in direct costs. So new investigators, RO1, don't go over $250,000. You will be called out. I know that sounds like a huge amount of money. It is a huge amount of money. K award, the amount of money is dictated, so I'm not going to touch that. It's dictated for R21s and R3s as well. The other thing to keep in mind about your teammates, another point about teammates. After you submit this grant, it's very hard to think about the fact that, well, now I've submitted this grant, and at some point in the relatively near future, I'm going to be thinking about my next grant, because everything I do on this grant is going to dictate whether I get the next grant. Here's the thing I want you to keep in mind about collaborators. If you include someone as a co-investigator, not a co-principal investigator, just a member of your team, the expectation will be that for each major player, they're going to produce additional publications. So the more people on your team, the more publications that will reasonably be expected of you during the course of carrying out this research. If you have people on the team who probably don't have the capability of putting out a publication, it will cost you. Would we expect a biostatistician to do a publication? No. But the major players on the team, we would. So keep that in mind. And I end with common mistakes. When you see the words on the directions that say 6 to 8 pages, you can get terrified and start including just randomly every piece of data you or your lab or your clinical team has ever generated. All it does is confuse the reviewers. Include pertinent preliminary data, data that support this particular research project. If you include contradictory data, it's terribly confusing unless you put in words to clarify it. Don't expect reviewers to be familiar with the data from your publications. If those data really are key, summarize them. And again, we talked about not having holes between what you propose in your methods and what you've accomplished in preliminary studies. And finally, the point I made earlier, and I want to remake it, in preliminary studies, when you're writing your preliminary studies, it isn't the work done by Jones et al., by Mever et al. We did this, we did that, our team, our group. It's first person. And one last point. I've talked about the importance of preliminary studies, and it is such an easy thing to do, to talk about the results that you got in preliminary studies that depended upon your use of a certain piece of equipment. And then you go and you're writing up the budget and you ask for that same piece of equipment. And in a cost-conscious environment, every reviewer is going to look at it and say, well, how'd you get the preliminary studies if you didn't have this? You're requesting it, but you must have one because your preliminary studies required the use of this piece of equipment. Let's say you were borrowing it from someone. Put that in, justify. So be careful that there isn't this disconnect between preliminary studies and what you're asking for in the budget. You can always justify in the budget justification. The preliminary studies were based on the use of a piece of equipment that Dr. So-and-so was kind enough to lend to our team. Okay? So that's preliminary studies. Again, to summarize, your reviewers want to see, the NIH wants to see new investigators funded. I think that's a push that will continue into the future. So even though it's a hard time to compete for funding, I think you can make an argument for the idea that it's a good time to compete. The only grants on which the NIH is going to give extra credit to new investigators, if you will, is the R01. If you compete for an R03 and an R21, you're competing head-to-head with anyone else who applies. With an R01, you get extra, you get a different review. They amend the review criteria. They're looking at feasibility, potential, not just track record. So there are definitely good reasons to think about an R01 if you are indeed eligible.